Hey, what's going on, everyone? Mike Singer at blueandgold.com, joined by Matt Miller, NFL draft scout and insider at thedraftscout.com. Before we get into it, Matt, just tell us about your website that you recently launched and what Notre Dame fans following the Irish players entering the draft, what they can expect.
Yeah, Mike, thanks for having me on. After a decade of building up a draft brand at Bleacher Report, I decided this past summer that it was time to kind of go do something new and a new adventure. And I'm excited about this. Like you said, it's thedraftscout.com, scouting reports, big boards. You're going to get featured. I'm going to write a column once a week called the Scouting Notebook, which was kind of a staple of what I did at Bleacher Report. So all the normal draft stuff you're used to, but then also some cool, I'm calling them perks, where if you sign up, we're going to do special Q&A sessions, going to have happy hours virtually, and some NFL players, friends like that are going to stop by. And then also some scouting clinics where you can actually learn from people like Matt Bowen, Jeff Schwartz, Duke Manyweather, Quincy Avery, who's a great quarterback coach, who works with guys like Deshaun Watson. So a lot of really cool things. So it's not just, you're not just, subscribing to read a mock draft once a week. It's some of these other things. So for people who love football, college football, NFL, love the NFL draft, or even folks who want to learn what it takes to scout, something I think they'd be interested in.
And this is Matt Miller. You can follow him on Twitter at NFL Draft Scout. Well, we're here to talk about Notre Dame's guys entering the draft. And I guess kind of place I want to start is when you watch Notre Dame on tape, when they're playing, the likes of Alabama and Clemson, which, played Clemson twice and Alabama once. Just how talented is the Notre Dame football team? Like, what kind of stands out to you on tape when you watch the Irish?
Well, I think Brian Kelly's done a great job there. I really do feel like he's underrated as a head coach on a national level, where he doesn't get talked about in the conversation with Nick Saban, Dabo Swinney, Lincoln Riley, whoever else you might want to put in that group, Ryan Day, of course. I think he's right there with that group, and it shows that this is consistently one of the best teams in the country, not just on the field, but in terms of talent, Mike. And this year, we're going to see it with Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah is a top 15 player, in my opinion. Every year at Notre Dame, you're going to have offensive linemen. Liam Eichenberg is really, really talented. And even last year, after losing people like Cole Kmet, Chase Claypool, some really great prospects, is reloaded this year. And I think that's what's great about Notre Dame. I do consider them. This is a tier one school. And maybe you do want to say tier two, but if you do that, that means only Alabama is in tier one. They're the only people who are up there by themselves. So I think from a talent perspective, we've heard for 30 years it's harder to recruit at Notre Dame. The academic standards are harder. I think what Brian Kelly's been able to do there over the last 10 years is really, really impressive. And for me, when it's time to scout offensive line, it's time to scout tight ends. I started Notre Dame. That's where I want to go first to see what type of talent they have. And this year it's spilling over. The defensive front seven is loaded with guys. Next year there's going to be a safety coming out of there who's pretty good. You've got a young tight end who's exceptional, a young running back who's one of my favorite players in the entire country. So it's not even just about, it's a senior loaded class. This is a really good program that is consistently churning out. This year I have 9 Notre Dame prospects ranked in my top 300. It's going to be the same next year. It's going to be the same year after that. It's consistently a pipeline to the NFL at this point.
Kind of with Notre Dame fans, I feel like there's even after maybe I shouldn't say all. It's definitely not all Notre Dame fans. There's a group of the fan base that even though Notre Dame just reached the college football playoff for a second time in 3 years, there's a frustration that Notre Dame's not in that like tier one level. Um, as a scout, where do you kind of stand on Notre Dame comparing to, the Alabamas and the Clemsons, the Ohio States of the world? Do you kind of see Notre Dame in that like clear tier two category with like an Oklahoma and Georgia and, an LSU, those kind of programs?
Yeah, I think the difference, I would say Notre Dame, yeah, it's in a tier two when you talk about that, when you talk about the scouting perspective. The difference between like a Notre Dame and an LSU is very cyclical. Last year, phenomenal. 15, 16 guys coming out of there that you had to really scout and evaluate. This year, not that many. There's a couple receivers who are really good, and then there's kind of a drop off. So I think the one thing that Coach Kelly's done really well at South Bend is getting that consistent group. So, like I said, Alabama's just in a world all by themselves. Ohio State is pretty dang close to that. This year's going to be a little bit of a drop off even for Ohio State. I mean, obviously Justin Fields is phenomenal, but he's their only, I think, sure thing as a first round pick. Maybe Wyatt Davis is closer to a sure thing. Chris Olave has a great chance to be a first round pick, but they don't have the powers on defense this year that we're accustomed to from Ohio State. So I think that's what I think Notre Dame's a lot closer than maybe some of the fan base realizes, if that is, a perception out there, that this is not a top tier school. Notre Dame is one of the five best schools, especially if you look at not just this year, but if you look at the last 4 years, the last 6 years, whatever it might be. Notre Dame's going to be one of those schools that continually produces. I think what might hurt that perception is there's not been a quarterback come out of Notre Dame that is a top tier prospect. Deshaun Kaiser was a second round pick, really hasn't done anything in the NFL. So I think that hurts that perception, where with Alabama, you had Tua. With Clemson, you have Deshaun Watson and Trevor Lawrence. At LSU, you get Joe Burrow last year. So if there's a perception out there that Notre Dame is somehow below those other schools, it's probably based more on the quarterback instead of looking at tight ends, offensive linemen, linebackers, defensive linemen. If you take away quarterback, I would argue that Notre Dame's up there as good as anyone else in the country.
Let's move to talk about some of those guys in particular. You mentioned Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah. He feels a top 15 pick. Man, at that Notre Dame rover position, he's been so good for the Irish in 2019, 2020. What do you see about Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah on film that makes you think that he's a surefire first round pick?
Yeah, so the things you look for: athletic ability, and then do they have position-specific traits that translate to the next level? The athletic ability is obviously there. 39-inch vert, 10-3 broad jump. I know Notre Dame says they've clocked him over 20 miles an hour. That's pretty exceptional. But then you look at the positional traits that translate. You mentioned it, playing rover. He has to play in coverage. He has to play in space. He has to break down and make tackles. Against a team like a Clemson, he's asked to spy and go chase the running backs and the mobile quarterback. So there's a lot there in his game that definitely translates to the NFL, where I can watch him play and say, oh yeah, this is what this guy's going to go do on Sundays. It's the same thing. So I think that's what makes him really, really special and a lot of fun to watch, because you definitely notice the athleticism, but then you see the football IQ and all the other pieces that go into that puzzle too.
Yeah, Notre Dame just here recently had Aaron Banks declare early.
Yeah.
Can you touch on Aaron Banks? You mentioned Liam Eichenberg. I'm not sure. You mentioned 9 guys in your top. I want to say it was 300. You might even have
Mhm.
Robert Hainsey. I mean, there's 4 really
Yeah.
good Notre Dame offensive linemen that we feel will be drafted. Can you speak on those 4?
Yeah, I have them all ranked as draftable, and we saw that. I think when after the Alabama game, you see those guys get together with Ian Book and kind of acknowledging that was the last ride, but it's been a heck of a unit. And I do think Aaron Banks, like you said, he declared. I have a round 3 grade on him right now, but it is an early round 3 grade, and with a chance to move up. It's a decent interior offensive line class. It's not great, so I wouldn't be surprised if he floats up in that group a little bit. I really like what he brings to the table, and you mentioned with Eichenberg, to be a 5th-year player, you love the experience there. And, even going back last year, there are guys that he's handling on film that no one else in the country was able to do. And so you love the experience with offensive line play in the NFL, not just at tackle, but especially there. We've reverted back to, let's go to these traditional powers, the Notre Dames, the Wisconsins, the Michigans, and look for guys who are doing NFL things instead of going to Texas A&M and drafting an athlete who you then have to hope can transition and learn those positions and bulk up, add strength. Now it's just like, hey, let's go to Notre Dame and Wisconsin because we know what these guys can do, and we'll plug them right into a scheme. It helps when you have, Zach Martins of the world coming out, and Quentin Nelson's, where they're just, you step in the NFL and you're one of the best at your position. So I think that helps. It helps Aaron Banks. It helps Robert Hainsey. It helps Liam Eichenberg, because you know what that is. You know exactly what this guy's been asked to do in college. You know where he's at from a strength and conditioning standpoint. You know what the coaching staff has put on his plate, and there's not as much of a projection where there might be with some of the other guys. So I think that's why you mentioned it, 4 guys. I think they all get drafted. I think 3 get drafted in the first 3 rounds. So they're in a very, very good spot there.
Yeah, so you have Aaron Banks, Liam Eichenberg, Robert Hainsey, and Tommy Kramer.
And
Notre
Tommy's
Dame.
been there forever, it feels like.
Yeah.
Feels like
Um,
Tommy's been there for 8 years. So
Yeah, Hainsey's been playing since a freshman. So yeah, I mean Notre Dame didn't have any offensive lineman draft last year, and now you see why, because they have 4 coming out this year. Wanted to touch on the quarterbacks, or a couple for Notre Dame. First, Ian Book. Matt, I've messaged with you previously to get your thoughts on Book. I know you probably don't see him as a draftable guy, but my thought, and you can tell me if I'm totally off here, is that I feel like he would be a solid practice squad kind of guy to emulate a Russell Wilson or a Baker
Yeah.
Mayfield or a Kyler Murray. Shorter, very mobile. He was at his best when he was just kind of running around like a Johnny Manziel type player. So, am I off here, Matt?
I actually do see him as draftable. And Mike, here's the reason why. I do a lot of like historical comparisons. And so I went back with Ian Book and I looked at the guys who were in the draft last year. It was like, okay, where was the cutoff line for people who were drafted? Do I feel like Ian Book is above or below that line? And I actually like him better than I liked Jake Fromm, who was picked in the fifth round last year. So to me, he is a draftable prospect based on that. And especially the like you said, the athleticism is really good for the position, even though he's not that big and his lower body mechanics are all over the place. But he's a captain, he's a leader. He won a ton of games in college. He is athletic. And I think he is a player that when you're actually under the lights, not just in a practice setting, you're under the lights, he steps up. He plays better on Saturdays than he's going to look on Fridays in practice. And so I think that that's going to help him. Now, am I going to sit here and say he's going to be an NFL starter? Absolutely not. But I do think he belongs in the NFL and could have a really nice long career. Like, could he be a Chase Daniel? Absolutely. Could he be a Colt McCoy type guy? 100%. Could he be a Gardner Minshew even, who ends up in a camp and impresses people and winds up starting for a little bit? I do think those are all possibilities. It's just leveling your expectations. He's going to be a day 3 pick. He's one of the best quarterbacks, that we've seen in college football over the past 2 to 3 years. It's an exceptional run there. But then you do have to like level set a little bit and say, okay, he's going to be a day 3 pick. Let's hope he gets in a situation where, as you mentioned, like you pray to God he goes to the New Orleans Saints, where they've worked with a player like this in Drew Brees and where they have a Taysom Hill, and you say, okay, a guy like this works there really, really well with a coach like Sean Payton. So it's just about getting Ian Book into the right situation where he can succeed.
As we're recording this on Thursday afternoon, no word from Tommy Tremble about whether or not he will be entering the NFL draft, but does seem to be trending that way. Matt, do you have strong opinions on Tommy Tremble coming out after his third season and where he might fit in with the other tight end prospects coming out?
I always feel bad when things like this happen, Mike. I was tweeting about Tommy Tremble a couple weeks ago. It's like, I don't know if this guy comes out, but every time I watch Notre Dame play, he's one of my favorite players because he just makes plays. And that happens a lot in my job where you're like, you know what, the guy's a junior. I have no idea if he's going to come out, but man, I like watching him play football. And at Notre Dame, there's that long history of tight ends. He's the most athletic one that I've seen come through there, in at least in recent memory. It's just exceptional ability there. Now, the problem is he didn't get a lot of touches, didn't get a lot of reps because the ball is so spread around there, especially over the last 2 years that he was playing, as you mentioned. So never more than 20 catches in a season. That's going to raise question marks, but the athleticism is definitely there. The body type is, Evan Ingram-esque. It's what you want at that position with, Darren Waller, Evan Ingram, guys like that making plays now. So I really like Tommy Tremble. I would, if I were asked to advise on him, I would say, I understand there's going to be a quarterback change, but going back, have that breakout year, improve a little bit as a blocker, show a more well-rounded game. You can make yourself a lot of money when you're not in a draft class, potentially with, Kyle Pitts, who is a lot like you, but has a lot better production. You have Pat Freiermuth. You have, the Brevin Jordans at Miami. It's a good tight end class. So you could look at next year and say, man, if he has a good year, he could be the top tight end next year as opposed to we might be looking at the 4th or 5th tight end this year, and that's all based on potential, not based so much on what we've seen.
Part of it's got to be, and you touched on earlier, Notre Dame's got a great young tight end, Michael Mayer. I don't know if Tommy Tremble
He's
will get
pretty
it.
good,
He might not break
right?
20 catches if he would come back for the 2021 season. You touched on the quarterback change. Before we started recording, you said that you haven't done a ton of scouting on Coan specifically, but you've watched Wisconsin football, especially with some of the offensive linemen they've had. Thoughts on Notre Dame's new quarterback? Did you, if he would have came out instead of transferred, do you feel like he could have been a draftable player in this year's draft?
Yeah, he would not have been for me, just based on what I've seen. And it was hard this year, with Wisconsin not having much of a season. But I think with Jack Coan, the thing you're getting is experience. And sometimes in college football, that's the most important thing. Somebody who's played in the Big Ten. And I like his short to intermediate accuracy game. He's just not going to be a big down the field thrower for you guys. So, but when you have Michael Meyer, you have Kyron Williams, that might be good enough. Might be good enough to get by. I don't keep up with Notre Dame recruiting like you do, so I wouldn't look at Jack Coan and say if you've had a top tier recruit come in, I wouldn't say that this is locked up. It kind of reminds me last year when we saw guys like Jamie Newman pop up at Georgia, and it's like, oh, okay, well, everybody just expects he's going to be the starter. Turns out he wasn't. And so I would say keep an eye on that. Know, once you guys figure out what you got at the position throughout spring ball, I don't think Jack Coan's good enough where you just automatically pencil him in and say, well, here's our surefire starting quarterback. If there's somebody who has the ability in camp to unseat him, I think it could be a wide open race.
He's got 18 starts in his college career. Notre Dame's returning 0, so the experience factor surely is
Mm-hmm.
important. Before we get you out of here, Matt, early buzz for future Notre Dame NFL draft picks. Mayor's certainly someone I'm sure you want to talk about. Kyron Williams. You mentioned you like. Is there any other guys that that you really like?
Yeah, I mean, Kyle Hamilton is, I think, where honestly, as great as Michael Meyer and as great as Kyron Williams are, it starts with Kyle Hamilton.
Right.
He's exceptional. And I really, truly believe that he was the best safety in college football this year. And so we got to wait another year before he's even draft eligible. So we could be talking about one of the highest drafted safeties since Jamal Adams, honestly, when he comes out. If he plays up to expectation next year, I'm just fascinated with his game. And hopefully this isn't a situation where we have like a Grant Delpit type year where a guy has all that buzz and all that hype and then he takes a gigantic step back. So hopefully we see Kyle Hamilton build on that success. I love Michael Meyer. I mean, everybody wanted to talk about Pat Freiermuth being the baby Gronk. You guys got him at South Bend because he's exceptional. He does everything you want at the position, and he does it with athleticism and burst and agility. It's all there. Kyron Williams, I mean, he's got to be on Heisman shortlist for next year, especially with an uncertain quarterback situation. I would expect him to get a ton more carries. And, the breakout that he had this year was tremendous. So hopefully we get 12 games next year and he's able to put together a 2,000-yard season because he's definitely capable of it.
Yeah, the early odds actually have Kyron Williams. I think it was like eighth or ninth or somewhere in there among that. What is it about
We
Hamilton?
can't bet Missouri, but we can't bet Missouri. I'd be all over that if we could. So
What is it about Hamilton that you think he's that good? I mean, those are some lofty expectations and thoughts on him.
yeah, I just feel like it's the total package. It's a lot of times we see safeties in college. A lot of them are just production through opportunity. And I see him actually create his own production. He is finding the ball and getting there. He's put himself in position pre-snap even to be there to make a play. This isn't like a Gerard Holloman getting 14 picks because quarterbacks are throwing the ball up in the air and he's basically returning a punt. So it's more the instincts, the football IQ, and then you wrap that up in a package of athleticism. The body type is perfect for the NFL. It's exactly what scouts want when they look at the safety position, especially the modern NFL where you have to be able to cover tight ends, slot receivers, running backs. You're able to chase down fast quarterbacks. So I think that's what Kyle. What you see is everything is right there. So it's just a matter of him having that that marquee season next year would definitely. I mean, I haven't fleshed out a full big board for next year, but I've got like 10 names that will be at the top of it, and he's definitely one of them.
All right, that's Matt Miller. You can follow him on Twitter at NFL Draft Scout, and thedraftscout.com is where you can find all of his draft coverage. We appreciate you coming on, Matt.
You bet, man. Thank you so much.